that year, some cities had witnessed unrest, especially in Tehran. Then it was December the 30th, equivalent on the Iranian calendar, the 9th of day, when all the protests came to an end. Iranians came out in mass throughout the country to say that enough was enough and that they would not allow any instability inside of the country, nor anyone hijacking their revolution. Well, today, Iranians mark the anniversary of that event, and our correspondent, Ghanbar Naderi, was on the scene at the rally in Tehran. He joins me now to walk us through a little bit about the process today.
Well, Marzia, it was a magnificent scene to see. You had to be there to believe your own eyes what was happening in the Iranian capital and the rest of the country. Millions of people took to the streets nationwide in order to mark this important and historic day, in order to once again make allegiance to the Islamic revolution and their leader Ayatollah Khamenei, and to tell the world that after 8 years they are still on the scene and they are going to commemorate this important day for the simple fact that they need to remain up to date, because they said that America refuses to stop its or end its hostility towards the Iranian nation, despite the signing of the nuclear deal between Iran and the United States, or the so-called P5+1 of group of nations. They also said that the country is more than ever vigilant because enemies of Iran, including Israel, Saudi Arabia, and America, continue to support this kind of violence, unrest, and sedition in the country. And they talked about the previous days in some of the Iranian cities in which small unrests took place, during which people voiced their concern about the economic situation and called on their government to do something about it, like create new jobs, like stop the runaway prices from going even further, the price hikes, also to boost the production sector. They said that these are the least things that we expect from the government, and the government should do anything about it. By the way, speaking of doing something about it, many officials to the parliamentarian speakers, the lawmakers, the religious leaders also urged the government not to blame anyone for the sorry state of affairs in the economy, and actually listen to people and do something about it before things get out of hand. They said that the government has every right and has every duty to take this situation seriously. By the way, Marzia, I was in one of these huge rallies in the Iranian capital at the Grand Musalla of Tehran, in which tens of thousands gathered inside the Musalla, in the middle of which the authorities had to stop people from getting in because there was no more space, and it was a packed place. It was jammed with protesters, and they were there to mark the occasion as well. And also I filed this interesting report for Press TV. Let's take a look. Millions of Iranians from all walks of life took to the streets nationwide on Saturday to celebrate the 8th anniversary of Day 9 Epic, which refers to mass rallies held across Iran on December 30, 2009 to protect the Islamic Republic. The 2009 rallies put an end to months of foreign orchestrated political unrest, which erupted following the presidential poll the same year. 8 years on, people who gathered in the capital, Tehran, told Press TV that the event was the true manifestation of the nation's political progress, a shot at the heart of the United States and Israel that were seeking to pit political parties against each other to further the vicious plots against Iran.
Come and see for yourself that people are still on the scene. If you try to repeat the sedition of 2009, we will once again take to the streets to stand firmly behind our revolution and our leader.
We gathered here to show our national unity and resolve. This has nothing to do with politics. No one should ever exploit the significance of this day for personal gains.
People who rallied on Saturday expressed support for the Islamic establishment and highlighted the significance of taking part in the event.
We came here to make allegiance to our leader and the establishment. Today we are honoring all those who sacrificed their lives to protect our divine beliefs and values.
That post-election unrest is behind us, but there are others waiting to happen with some help from our enemies. Commemorations like this help us to stay on guard and up to date.
The 2009 political unrest erupted after two of the presidential candidates, namely Mehdi Karoubi and Mir Hossein Mousavi, who had lost the election, claimed that the results had been rigged.
The 2009 post-election unrest was put to rest a long time ago, but that does in no way mean that Iran's enemies will sit on their hands and won't try their luck again. In the words of officials, just like today, this means people should remain vigilant at all times. Ahmad Nodari, Press TV, Tehran.
All right, well, I'd like to thank our correspondent, Ganbay Nadari, being in the studio with me and also for that package. And I'd like to welcome our guest to the program out of Tehran, Professor, University of Tehran, Mohammad Marandi, and author and political scientist, Mr. Kaveh Afrasiabi, out of New York. Thank you both for being with us and starting it off in New York. And Kaveh Afrasiabi, it has been 8 years since the unrest in 2009. Do you find it interesting that Iranians mark this day so enthusiastically 8 years later? And why is that the case, in your opinion?
Well, first of all, I have a sense of historical deja vu because I was sitting in one of your programs with Dr. Marandi debating the merits of the complaints of various presidential candidates, and I believe that Professor Marandi concurs with me in saying that without any exaggeration, we both feel exonerated by history and the subsequent events and all the subsequent opinion polls that confirm that basically the results of the 2009 elections were valid and there were no mass rigging and so on and so forth. But I think that because of the enormous political jolt that was associated with the post-election trauma, there is a sense of urgency on the part of the very politically awakened Iranian people to ensure that that unhappy episode does not repeat itself, and the foreign hands that meddled in various ways in order to stir trouble in Iran are blocked effectively and are unable to repeat their mischief. And this is one of the main reasons why we see the Iranian people present on the stage, expressing the collective political will and demonstrating to the outside world that they have learned a very important historical lesson and they are there to protect the gains of the Islamic Revolution.
Well, Professor Marandi, what do you think was the overall goal of the unrest following the election, and who do you believe was actually behind it all?
Well, as your guest rightly pointed out, it was roughly at this time, maybe briefly actually a short time after the election 8 years ago, that there was a debate on this show with a professor from England who had a huge budget from, I think, Chatham House to prove that the election was fraudulent. And during the debate, he had absolutely nothing to say. And any claim that he made, an adequate response was provided, and he actually left the debate in the middle. He got so agitated. I think the host was your colleague Nargis Moballighi at that time. It was an interesting debate, but it showed that there was no evidence behind the accusations, and that is really the sad thing. I personally was not a fan of either of the two major candidates, but the reality was that people voted for former President Ahmadinejad, and if Mr. Mousavi and his friends had behaved reasonably, we wouldn't have witnessed the hardship that followed and the sanctions that the United States was able to impose upon us because our country was weakened as a result of the riots in Tehran and other cities. And the turnout today actually on the commemoration, I think, wasn't supposed to be very high. I think it was because of the last couple of days that people decided to come out in such large numbers. And it's very disappointing to see that Western media outlets, especially Persian outlets like BBC Farsi, VOA, and other outlets that are funded by regimes such as the United States and England, that they have been trying to intensify the riots and the protests. And whereas their own regimes, especially both complain about alleged Russian interference in their elections. So the hypocrisy is quite clear and obvious. And then you have other outlets right now that are telling people over the last couple of days to make Molotov cocktails and to attack the police. And these outlets are funded by regimes like Saudi Arabia and Western governments, and they are allowed to function, whereas Press TV is blocked by European and companies because of its political position. And so on.
So to contribute to the ongoing resistance against Saudi Arabia, which has crossed all lines.
Yemen's Ansar Allah fighters and their allies have been launching attacks against Saudi positions in an effort to force Riyadh to end its war. However, Riyadh has remained defiant to end the conflict, which the top UN official in Yemen has called an absurd and futile war. Jimmy McGoldrick said the war has only resulted in the destruction of Yemen and the suffering of its people. More than 13,600 people, mainly civilians, have been killed since the war began nearly 3 years ago. Mohammed Attab, Press TV, Sana'a.
Our guests for tonight's debate are author and political commentator Dr. Kevin Barrett, who is joining us live from Madison, and we're also joined by Middle East expert Mr. Jihad Mourkadeh, who is joining us live now from Beirut. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining us. Mr. Mourkadeh, do you agree with the UN humanitarian coordinator who has called the Saudi-led aggression on Yemen an absurd war?
I do not call it a Saudi aggression, because if you call it a Saudi aggression, then it is a UN aggression against Yemen. It is the UN who has requested the Houthis withdraw from Sana'a under Resolution 2216. So now if somebody is getting the Houthis to withdraw, we call it an aggression, then they are calling their own resolution an aggression.
So are you saying then, Mr. Mourkadeh, that the UN humanitarian coordinator to Yemen is wrong in calling this an absurd war?
I am not saying he is wrong. All I'm saying is he should get his act together and review Resolution 2216. Now, there are two sides to it. Obviously, from a humanitarian point of view, he is doing his job. And of course, like all human beings, everybody is worried about the humanitarian situation. On the other hand, you have a political situation that the UN is responsible for.
Okay, Dr. Barrett, I wanted to get your opinion on that then.
And the UN is supposed to resolve the situation.
I will get back to you, Mr. Mourkadeh. Let me just go to Dr. Barrett. Dr. Barrett, I wanted to get your opinion on this, the UN humanitarian coordinator Yemen calling this an absurd war. What do you make of that?
Well, he's right, of course. And the fact is that even though the Saudis are essentially the puppets of the dominant but fading empire based in the financial centers of London, New York, and Tel Aviv, and that empire does largely control, if not dominate, the UN. It's impossible to ignore the fact that this war has been a complete disaster for the Saudis, who are indeed waging a war of aggression. This war is about extending Saudi control across the Arabian Peninsula into Yemen, so the Saudis would be able to put in pipelines, and they wouldn't be vulnerable anymore to selling oil through the Persian Gulf, which of course Iran can shut down if it needs to. So there's a huge geostrategic dimension here. Now, most of the world has essentially capitulated and gone along with the U.S.-British Zionist empire in wishing that the Saudis could own and dominate Yemen and indeed construct those pipelines and have that geostrategic advantage, because the Saudis are puppets of that empire. But the people of Yemen have a very different view. So the UN has this kind of schizophrenic approach where on the one hand it has to go along with the Saudi puppets of empire or they'll be threatened with more cut-offs of funding in more credible ways than we recently saw from the US. But at the same time, they have to acknowledge that this is a humanitarian disaster. And indeed, from the viewpoint of the Saudi